We got the first session ready. The title is Freedom and Accessibility, How the European University Initiative Can Contribute to a More Inclusive and Higher Education. And we have our first guest of the session, of course, the moderator, which we can welcome with an applause, Professor Manuel João Costa, Vice-Rector for Student Affairs and Pedagogical Innovation, University of Minho.
Thank you.
Please.
Bom dia. Good morning to everyone. What an amazing scenery. It is a pleasure to be here, welcoming you to this session about freedom and accessibility and how the European University Initiative can contribute to a more inclusive higher education. My name is Manuel João Costa, and it's my pleasure to be moderating this session with our distinguished speakers that I will introduce in a moment. A deep thank you for the organizers for inviting me to moderate this session in this role. I feel very privileged to be here with you in this role, and of course with such a renowned panel in special. We at the University of Minho feel, of course, also very privileged to be part of this ambitious alliance. Accessibility, inclusion, freedom are part of our core mission and our core values. As Pro-Rector for Innovations in Teaching and Learning and Student Affairs, the dimension of inclusion, accessibility, and freedom has a special concern for my activity, and I look very much forward also to be learning from this session. I will introduce the speakers in a minute. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Eva Egron-Polak, that she's here somewhere. Oh, hello, Eva. And unfortunately, the fact Hans de Witt that cannot be with here physically, but fortunately, we will have him on the screen with us, which is wonderful. Technology is also very helpful. Again, it was said today, just a while ago. So in Arqus we see accessibility, inclusion, and freedom as the founding pillars for the Alliance. The mission statement that was signed yesterday by our rectors includes clear statements right up front concerning these values. We believe that our mission, first line, is educating critical and socially engaged European citizens equipped for lifelong learning, and I'm going to emphasize this part, leaving no one behind. So all about accessibility and inclusion. We also talk about in our mission statement about the idea of bringing down barriers to effective cooperation. Of course, this can be interpreted as interinstitutional cooperation, but it can also be interpreted as internal, within the institution, getting silos more open to everyone. And perhaps it is something that we should think about when you talk about inclusion. But let's return to the Alliance and again state from the mission statement some of the values. One of the values, first line, the core European values of democracy, the rule of law, respect for diversity and human rights, solidarity and the pursuit of peace and justice in Europe and the world. This is the first line of our values. So it's obvious that we are really compromised with these topics. Of course, none of these values, none of this mission will be achievable if we have barriers to accessibility, and we ignore the importance of inclusion. And nothing can happen if freedom is at risk, as we now very much see every day. And being free, and we are solidarity within our alliance, is also cherishing the liberty of everyone, not only our own. As Willem Faulkner wrote, we must be free not because we claim freedom, but because we practice it. So we should really think about how important it is to be free and to practice freedom within our institution. And freedom is always something that we take for granted, something that will stay forever. And unfortunately, our current circumstances show that that's clearly not the case. So perhaps on the three topics, we have many concerns about our institutions, but let me highlight at least one concern that hopefully we will learn something today to do it better within our institutions and within our interinstitutional alliance. Accessibility. We have challenges on promoting accessibility. Of course, we have underrepresented social groups, which is, I believe, a wider issue across the world. And we have to face very particular and specific social, demographic, legislative, and economic circumstances. And now we have a very pressing and urgent need, which is to think about the accessibility of the refugees that are now being generated by this horrible war that we have now in Europe. On inclusion, perhaps one of the main challenges that we have is to move away from inclusion as a siloed idea. It seems that it's just a concern for a few people within our institutions. It cannot be like that. We have to open this box. We have to make all institutions, everyone within our institutions and across institutions, to really think about how we can design a special, a socially just higher education with zero barriers for all. On freedom, I said it before, we always take it for granted, and that's really, that's not really sure, as we have learned. So we have to really learn how we can keep freedom alive and the idea of freedom alive and think about it and how we can actually keep promoting it under such external challenging circumstances within our institution and across the Alliance. So hopefully, we trust this session will bring us closer together and shine some light in our collaborative future and dealing and promoting with these issues. So, after this introduction, let us move swiftly to our session. The duration of this session is generous enough so we can have a wider participation. So hopefully accessibility to the session and to the questions and answers at the end will not be a problem. And I hope everyone feels included and may want to ask questions. We will have, of course, in the beginning, the presentations of our two speakers, but at the end there will be time for questions and answers. We believe that this session will be the more interesting, the more voices we bring to the table for the discussion. And this means, of course, students, this means, of course, staff, and this means, of course, professors and senior administrators. So at the end, please participate in this session. We really look forward to have your questions. It is your questions that will make the Arqus between the concepts and our interinstitution reality. And so hopefully we will have a great discussion at the end. So I think it's time to move on and present our speakers.
Yeah, I'm coming. Sorry, I don't want to.
I know I'm fast.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. We invite you to return to your place. Thank you. So we also make some exercise, going ups and down, which is always a good idea. And so as Professor just said, and thank you very much for the opening to the participation part, which we think it's very, very, very important. Our second participant to the session is Eva Egron-Polak, former Secretary General, International Association University, and member of the International Advisory Board.
And she will talk us about freedom and inclusiveness, the cornerstones of a new social contract for universities. So thank you very much. Please. Yes.
Good morning. First of all, let me say how honored I am to be speaking this morning and to wish the University of Padua a very happy birthday and a birthday celebration that will, I think, last a full year. And we're honored to be here at this time, this very special time in Padua. To say that we live in an era of unprecedented change and disruption would be an understatement of massive proportions today. It seems we go from crisis to crisis, both natural and man-made, both near and far. Around us, we see the rise of populism, neo-nationalism, reliance on fake news and propaganda, stimulating xenophobia, racism, fear of the other. Those who propagate such views denigrate scientific knowledge and expertise and consider these to be politically biased and destined to control the freedom of individuals. Academic freedom is threatened on some campuses, which are divided by debates around wokism, Islamogauchism in France, critical race theory, and other theories. For the most part, these stem from and try to address injustices in our society, at home and across borders. And if that isn't enough, we also have a war on democracy and freedom raging in Europe at this time. So the two themes framing our conference, freedom and inclusiveness, are not only critical and most relevant issues for our societies and our universities, they're extremely timely, as are all the efforts we can make to create deep and strong international collaboration among different higher education institutions, as, of course, exemplified by Arqus. Let me begin my comments by a few personal anecdotes. They illustrate, I hope, how values such as freedom, which might be deemed universal and understood by all, are nevertheless colored by subjective and personal experiences and sometimes cultural biases. This can make the task of reaching a shared understanding of their meeting while respecting cultural differences potentially quite difficult, but no less essential. The concept of freedom has been especially in the limelight since the beginning of the pandemic, and now the war in Ukraine. At the beginning of this year, 2022, the so-called Freedom Convoy held my personal attention. In the name of freedom, the convoy occupied Ottawa, a peaceful, sleepy capital of Canada, where I lived for many years. It also blocked the Canada-US border. Ironically, this very same border crossing was where slaves who fled from US to Canada crossed in the 18th century. They called that passage the Freedom Trail. So obviously, freedom had very different meanings to those in those different instances. Not even a month later, we watched stupefied as Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine to squash an independent nation's and people's freedom to choose their own path. My 96-year-old mother, who lives in Canada very near to that freedom trail, and I, living in France, watch this war unfold. We were vividly reminded about our own past and the choices my parents made to cross the border from Czechoslovakia to Austria in 1968, while very similar tanks were rolling in to liberate us in that country. My parents also fled in search of freedom, including the freedom to educate their children as they wished. Daily, we are witnessing how the concepts of freedom and liberty are being interpreted, used, and often misused in unprecedented ways. In higher education, academic freedom for individuals and autonomy for institutions are foundational values, but they too carry different meanings and weight and connotations, and can be constrained in different ways depending on context. The long history of these values and their importance is very much a part of the history of the University of Padua, founded, as you all know, in 1222 by a group of students and professors seeking more academic freedom than they enjoyed in their institution of origin, Bologna. During the pandemic, we also saw how the cursor with regard to individual freedoms versus collective freedoms was not always situated in the same place when we looked around policy and actions around the world. So I also share these stories in order to underline that in an increasingly internationalized university, we must integrate and learn from the subjective viewpoints of all university staff and students. Their personal trajectories matter, and they color their sensitivities. I'm certain that my personal experience of being different, the only kid who did not speak English, the only kid who did not go to church every Sunday, who had never tasted Coca-Cola or ketchup before arriving in Canada, being different had had an impact on me. This brings me to the value and indeed the necessity of inclusiveness. In the educational system, and especially in the university, it is imperative to enjoy and provide a safe space for everyone to freely express diverse viewpoints and hold reasoned arguments about all topics and all values. This is, in fact, part of the responsibility that comes with the right to academic freedom and institutional autonomy. These freedoms confer obligations on the university, and on one of those obligations is to explore and encourage inclusion of various perspectives in learning and in research. It is also an obligation to fight exclusion and injustice, which stand as obstacles to achieving diversity. Being open to other perspectives is also necessary to understand where our own beliefs and reactions come from. Thus, inclusion and diversity are not only about learning from and about the other. It is a way to hold up a mirror and learn about ourselves. As our worlds become more and more interconnected, we need to recognize that in all relations, there are multiple ways of seeing, feeling, knowing, and even prioritizing values, even those as fundamental as freedom. I'm an optimist by nature, and by profession, I am a true believer in the power of universities and their capacity to change the world. History, and here in this room and in Padua, we're surrounded by it. History has shown how universities, as institutions, how enduring they are. They outlast numerous doomsday predictions about their disappearance because they evolve and change. In an era of rapid change, as we are living now, the needed transformations might appear to be too slow, especially for students, for decision makers, and even for the general public. So universities are often criticized for not being relevant, responsive enough, or even useful in our societies. But to argue that universities do not change is to ignore the numerous ways that universities are indeed changing their mission, and how often they change their mission with the specific intent to regain societal trust. Of course, this is also not the same in every context, but I believe that the direction of the changes we see, or the narrative about the needed transformation for universities of the future, is similar in many parts of the world. There's a growing, perhaps renewed emphasis on the university to play a much bigger civic role. And part of the process of becoming a civic university is a shift in the values that universities adopt as their cornerstones and the place they accord to those values in their mission statements and in their actions. Values such as those we're discussing today, freedom and inclusiveness, as well as ethics, equity, among others, are being discussed, articulated, and adopted in universities, but they're also becoming a critical framework for their interactions with society and internationally with other universities. What evidence is there for this shift? Well, reading the mission statement, the new mission statement that has already been cited, is a perfect case in point to demonstrate the commitment to the social responsibility and the civic role being played by this alliance. Arqus wants to be a societal player. It focuses on equity and sustainable future, wants to be an open place of freedom and pluralism, where socially engaged citizens thrive. Let me highlight a few other developments that show this trend. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, adopted in 2015, unite the world in a shared commitment to and responsibility for tackling challenges facing humanity and the planet that sustains us. This agreement constitutes an important global compact which places responsibility for change on all nations, rich and poor, and all sectors, including, of course, higher education and research. Today, we would be very hard-pressed to find a single university mission, statement, and policy that does not make a reference to their engagement to meeting these goals in research, in curriculum, and in introducing sustainable management practices to their operations. Higher education is claiming its role both as a critical analyst, but also as a proactive change agent in the search for a sustainable future. A second example is closer to home, perhaps. 30 years after the adoption of the Magna Carta Universitatum, a declaration adopted by more than 800 rectors over its lifetime, the Magna Carta Observatory, located just down the road in Bologna, deemed it was time to draft a new declaration which reflected better the current context of universities, not only in Europe, but globally. The 2020 Magna Carta Universitatum takes into consideration the major changes that have impacted on the role of universities in the past 2 or 3 decades. In addition to enshrining, again, the central foundational values of academic freedom and institutional autonomy, as in 1988, the new 2020 MCU adds responsibility to society as an equally important counterweight on which universities must be based. The 2020 MCU integrates the idea that rights confer obligations. The obligation, or the price to pay for freedom, is serving a societal purpose, becoming a civic university. Finally, a third sign of this shift towards more socially responsible actions is the more critical way in which we view internationalization of higher education. For decades, we took for granted that no matter what we did, higher education internationalization was a good thing. Today, the process is being questioned about its values, its value, and its impact. As a result, the purpose of this process became an integral part of its newest definition. Internationalization is not only about academic and scientific quality, it's also about making a meaningful contribution to society. Thus, again, focusing on the why of the process by looking beyond simply the university's own internal goals. There are many other developments that demonstrate that universities have fully abandoned the ivory tower, that they are adopting a more self-critical and civically engaged role to address social justice, equity, sustainability, and democracy. Even the rankers are jumping on board, and in 2019, Times Higher Education published the first impact ranking, with the number of universities wishing to be judged on their societal impact growing each year. Still, there are numerous books and articles about what is wrong with universities and how they need to change. So in addition to arguing that universities are already shifting their focus, let me cite a recent thought-provoking book by Professor Chris Brinks. He's the former Vice-Chancellor of the University of Newcastle in the UK and of Stellenbosch University in South Africa. In his book, he not only examines universities critically, but he also points to strategies that will take universities even further towards fulfilling their civic responsibilities without sacrificing quality, inclusion, and diversity, or the pursuit of excellence. The book is called The Soul of a University and challenges universities to balance out their very high and almost exclusive preoccupation with excellence by placing the purpose they serve on an equal footing. His book invites universities to focus as much on what they're good at, about excellence, as on what they are good for. In other words, their purpose, especially their purpose to society. He attributes the public's critical view of universities to the fact that they make it impossible to see how expertise benefits everyone. For Brink, the educational trickle-down effect has not worked, and the knowledge gap has become very large, in fact, too big. But in higher education, striving to be good at something and to be good for something is not a zero-sum game. Both parts reinforce each other. In Brink's view, quality is inseparable from equality, and in turn, equality is inseparable from diversity. The second important concept for our discussion today, inclusiveness through access. Universities are complex and multifaceted institutions, and their development is anchored in the national and, in Europe, increasingly regional context. Their freedom is not absolute, and their constraints imposed are often contextual. The national or regional policy and regulatory frameworks often dictate what is expected of them. These expectations have been highly economic in nature in recent decades, responding to labor market needs, increasing competitiveness, international attractiveness, technological innovation, among others. But more recently, and I think the European Universities Initiative is an example of this, social justice, social cohesion, cultural, environmental, and equity dimensions are taking a much larger place in the expected role of universities. As Arqus demonstrates very well, universities are shifting their attention to widen the scope of their responsibilities, to include strategies and actions, to eliminate inequalities and exclusion based on race, gender, ethnic origin, socioeconomic status, or age. But inclusiveness in higher education, to be a sustainable policy, needs to be about more than a response to external expectations. It is also about the recognition that inclusiveness and its consequent diversity is the road to excellence and relevance. As we turn more and more to challenge-based learning and research, the inclusion of many viewpoints is necessary, just as meeting the global challenges requires multidisciplinarity, so do our curriculum research efforts need the multiplicity of perspectives and lived realities that a diverse student, faculty, and staff population bring to the university. Exploiting diversity in the most positive sense of the word, though, is not without its own obstacles and difficulties. Respect, openness, self-analysis, and empathy can only be instilled in graduates if these values are the ethos of the university as a whole. And accessibility and choice for learners is insufficient if the environment into which they're admitted is not geared for retention, success. As the IAU 2008 statement on equitable access and success states, access without a reasonable chance of success is an empty promise. For inclusiveness to be more than a laudable goal and become a reality in the university or in an alliance of universities such as in Arqus means a transformation of all aspects of the institution. It needs to be reflected in the hiring process, in the promotional process, in outreach, student recruitment, admission, counseling, curriculum, the pedagogical approach, the research agenda, and of course the external, including the international relations. In today's world, it seems to me that universities do not have a choice. They need public support and trust, and to keep or gain it or regain it, they must meet the needs of a highly diverse population and respond to multiple societal expectations. Let me conclude by citing a recent UNESCO report about what these expectations are. Based on a global consultation on the future of higher education. The report is entitled Pathways to 2050 and Beyond, and its message is crystal clear. Respondents from around the world call for a higher education that improves quality of life, brings about social justice, cares about the environment, and places values such as equity and inclusion at the center of accessible and affordable higher education for all. Arqus, in its multiple action lines, and especially by exploring and addressing the issues of freedom and access in this conference, is clearly on track to fulfill these expectations. I wish you all the best, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your inspiring words.
So now we're really glad to be joined online by Professor Emeritus, International Higher Education of Boston College, Professor Hans de Witt.
Thank you, Professor, for being with us. The title of the abstract is Internationalization and Europeanization in Challenging Times, Obstacles and Opportunities for More Inclusive and Socially Responsible Networking and Cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be able to speak to you from Amsterdam, the Netherlands, to your conference. Congratulations on the University of Padua with its 1800th anniversary. And thank you, Manuel, and also Eva, for your introductory remarks, which align very much with my views and perceptions. We are indeed living in very challenging times for society, for higher education, and for international cooperation. The year 2020 can be seen as a turning point with the impact of and lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic and the urgency of climate change and the realization of sustainable development goals coming to the forefront, as Eva has been addressed. This all, unfortunately, is happening in a negative context of increasing geopolitical tensions and decreasing academic freedom, inclusiveness, and equity. The Russian invasion in Ukraine has a devastating impact on that country and its population, as well as its higher education, and it requires all our support. I have myself the privilege to accommodate already for 3 weeks in our house a family of 5 refugees from Ukraine, and by that every day we only not see how they suffer from that important decision to flee, but also how they notice how friends and families are affected, even dead, because of this horrific genocide by the Russian invasion and the Putin regime. But the impact is broader, with the people of Russia and its academic community returning after a period of openness and international cooperation during the past 3 decades to complete isolation and repression as during the first Cold War. Also there, I personally have faced how many of my Russian academic friends and colleagues have either to decide to flee their country or now are struggling with how to deal with what the regime is doing to their brothers and sisters in Ukraine, but also to their own professional life and their personal life. It's quite shocking how suddenly the world has changed. We also see, as a consequence of that, a stronger global divide between democracies and authoritarian regimes, and a resulting divide between academic freedom and a lack of it. China being unfortunately an other, but certainly not the only other example that we are seeing in the world. What this all means for equity, inclusion, and freedom in higher education has been well addressed by Eva Egron-Polak. I will be focusing much more on the impact of on internationalization and global academic cooperation exchange. Over the past 3 decades, we have seen internationalization in higher education move from marginal, ad hoc, and fragmented activities into more strategic and central policies at the institutional, national, European, and global level. But we also have seen higher education moving away from its traditional values of cooperation and exchange towards a more exclusive and competitive focus. Internationalization has become associated more and more with competition for students, scholars, positions in rankings, and access to top academic journals for only a small elite of institutions, academics, and students. We also have seen reactions to this shift in paradigm, as my colleague Marijke van der Wende has been writing, from cooperation to competition. A reaction including appeals for internationalization at home and of the curriculum, collaborative online international learning or virtual exchange, and internationalization at the service of for society. We see both in Europe and elsewhere that this appeal for a more inclusive and comprehensive form of internationalization is well received and gets attention in national and institutional policy briefs and documents. But unfortunately, at the same time, it stays in almost all cases by nice words on paper and in oral declarations. The reality was and still is predominantly that internationalization is mobility, exchange, and cooperation for and between a small elite of countries, institutions, staff, and students. A new generation of practitioners and scholars is challenging this neoliberal view of internationalization as a revenue source, dominated by Anglo-Western perspectives and forms of knowledge. The valuing of a broader range of epistemologies, including those from the Global South and indigenous communities, not only allows internationalization to become more inclusive, but also encourages innovation. And furthermore, there's more interrelatedness between internationalization and other significant concerns needed. As argued by Elspeth Jones, my colleague from the UK, and I quote, "Equality, diversity and inclusion, social justice, decolonization, global power relations and geopolitics, human rights, anti-racism, gender identity and equality, ethics, multiculturalism, and sustainability are just some of the related elements which all have to play an important role in broadening our understanding of internationalization." End of quote. Internationalization in higher education is a multifaceted evolving phenomenon. It touches on a wide scope of issues and can be defined in a multitude of ways. Its concept continues to be refined and revised, and theories and definitions adjusted to match new and evolving understandings and changing contexts. There's not one model of internationalization that fits all universities and institutions of higher education in the world. Context is very important, and also intention, as defined in the definition that Eva Egron-Polak quoted of, is clearly saying it doesn't go by itself. We have to make a difference. We have to make it adaptable to the needs of our individual context. These critical reflections on internationalization are important in response to its predominant existing still focus on mobility, revenue generation, and soft power. Even in the Global South, very few countries and institutions have inclusive and sustainable development policies in place. So there's still a long way to go, both here in Europe, the Anglophone world, and in the Global South, to make internationalization more sustainable and more inclusive. So the big question that we face now is, will higher education and its international dimensions post-COVID-19 and in the current situation of geopolitical tensions go back to the old normal? Or will innovative and transformative forms of inclusion emerge? And how can the European University Initiative and this alliance contribute to the realization of more inclusion and social responsibility in higher education? The ambitions were very high pre-pandemic, also in the European University Initiative alliances. Most of them said we have to increase in-person mobility to over 50% between the partners. But at the same time, there was little attention to alternative options of mobility and with a lack of awareness of the potential negative implications of that mobility in person for society. And then during Corona, almost all teaching and learning, as well as in-person mobility and exchange, came to a stop, and we had to get used to online delivery from nearly zero. Also, the AUI alliances and the European Commission had to adapt their objectives and targets for mobility and exchange. Unfortunately, we see indeed that virtual mobility and exchange is now more active than before, contributing to both inclusiveness, as more staff and students can benefit from online delivery, and to saving our planet. So let us not return completely to the old normal in mobility, but be more selective in relevant in-person mobility and exchange. Let us set virtual exchange as the new standard for mobility, and let us be more aware of the broader dimensions and implications. We can do much more and much better many things online, to start with seminars, workshops, and meetings. Just as a simple example, why should I have traveled to Padua for 1 or 2 days to participate in this panel? Of course, Eva and most of you could combine it with other activities and make it worth to do so. In the past, I would still have also traveled to Padua and its beautiful university, even if only for this panel, and for sure I would have loved it, as I loved past visits to the city and the university. Would it have been necessary? One can seriously question if that would have been the case. Internationalization for society, the international dimension of the third mission of universities, requires us to be more conscious in our education, our research, and our services of what are the implications of inclusiveness and climate change of our international cooperation. It will allow us to be more effective and extensive in our interactions, also in the Arqus Alliance. The European University Initiative, as well as the development of a European degree label and maybe in the future a European degree, are welcome to make higher education more European as well as inclusive. They allow us to work more intensively together to address the needs of Europe and beyond. And we for sure will discuss this more in this panel and during this conference, but let me give a warning based on over 40 years in international cooperation exchange as a practitioner and as a scholar. We have to be careful not to move too quick in making radical changes. Alliances such as Arqus are asked to be innovative and transformative, and this is important indeed. They also have to be inclusive in bringing internal and external stakeholders together. All positive, but it takes time to do so well. It's better first to learn before broadening the alliances and extending its number. What we mean with being European, innovative, transformative, and inclusive, in my view, has not yet been that clear and not yet sufficiently experienced. Sometimes a little exclusiveness is important to start, to make real inclusion for all possible for the future. In summary, as I wrote in my colleague Elspeth Jones in a recent paper, and I quote, a socially responsible approach to internationalization is not easy and requires substantial public and private resources. But it is more socially inclusive and in the long run will result in the tertiary education sector with higher quality. This approach implies paying greater attention to internationalization of the curriculum at home. It should align with other levels of education and better address the international dimensions of social responsibility. This is even more important than it was already, given the current complex geopolitical tensions and ongoing health, societal, and environmental challenges we are facing. I think that all higher education, and in particular alliances like Arqus, have to really focus their attention on the social responsibility and inclusiveness for the future, and in doing that in an academic-free approach. It will be a challenge given what we are facing today, but if we don't do it, we will fail and our planet will be in danger. So there's a lot to do, and I thank you very much and look forward to discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor De Wit, for your inspiring words too. Please stay with us, even on the screen, because we will continue now with the Q&A time.
So we ask Professor Costa and Dr. Egron-Polak to come and have a seat on the stage with us. And of course, for you to think about some questions, to ask them. We have also some helpful assistants going around with the microphones. So
they should be around there somewhere. Yeah. Please raise your hand. Okay, here they are. Okay, it was not a joke. So, Professor Da Costa, I don't know if you want to start collecting questions. We leave you the stage, of course.
So good morning again. Can you hear me? Yes. So we have minutes enough for a few questions on our side and many questions on your side. So maybe just to kickstart, I could start asking a couple of questions, but hopefully in the meanwhile you will be reflecting and finding your own questions, and I'll be paying a lot of attention to the audience all around me to see who has his hands up. So please participate in a moment. So perhaps we can start, Hans and Eva, with a very timely topic, which is the Russian invasion. So we've been talking a lot about freedom, we've been talking about accessibility and inclusion. In your perspectives, what are the implications of the Russian invasion for freedom and inclusion in higher education in Europe and beyond? Would any of you like to? Eva?
Yes. Eva, shall I start, or do you want to start?
I'll start very briefly, and then you go, Hans.
Yeah.
Well, I think the first thing is that we're once again talking about this issue. And I don't think we have, within Europe, talked for quite some time about the constraints on freedom as vividly as we are now. So we are, I think, forced to reflect about the values that, as an academic community, we hold dear. And of course, it's a question between the individual and the institutional. I think that there is a fairly general consensus that institutional collaboration and collaboration with Russian institutions has to be suspended, because it is not possible in a country at war, as an aggressor in war, to maintain those relations. But I think it's almost as impossible to forget that it is within the universities that academics are probably the bedrock of the opposition to this regime, and that if we stop collaborating and interacting with the individuals within those institutions, we're increasing the impossibility of finding or renewing relations after the regime falls. And I think we know that it is not going to remain forever. So I think we have to distinguish between individual and institutional collaboration, and I think we have to do whatever we can to maintain links with the individuals. As Hans has said, some of them are fleeing, and those who stay, and I think the vast majority will stay, are going to need all the exposure they can have to working with other Europeans and with the rest of the world. However, I also think that it's an individual conscience decision to how we proceed, and it's not an easy one. The implications are going to be with us for a long time, and I think we will, because of the war, think differently about the future in Europe.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Hans?
if I may add, yeah, thank you. If I may add to that, and I absolutely agree with Eva, we have to be careful to keep the relationships with the academics and with the students open as much as we can and not isolate them. I had a blog with Philip Albach in University World News this weekend where we gave some shocking examples of how we do exactly what Putin is doing to his academics, silencing them. That journals, publishers of books, even academics say, we don't want to collaborate with Russians anymore. We cancel you. We force you to do things which are sometimes impossible to do, to make declarations about genocide, which they cannot do because otherwise they will be taken in prison. It's sometimes so easy when you're not in a situation like our Ukrainian colleagues are and our Russian colleagues are, or even our Chinese colleagues increasingly are, because also there they are facing, as a result of the war and even before, lack of academic freedom, to say that we judge them and as a group. No, we have to judge them as individuals who also have opinions and might be different than the regime that is trying to control them. So we have to keep the individual channels open. Also, as Eva said, to make it possible for the future to build on that experience. If we isolate them, there will be no change. If we collaborate with them on an individual basis, and of course not with people who have been demonstrating that they are close to the regime and supporting the regime, we have to make the possibility for the future. Academic collaboration is very important, in particular in difficult times as now. It is much more easier in peaceful times, but now it is much more needed than ever to guarantee that we have a future together.
Thank you, Hans and Eva. So I'm still looking for arms in the air to see if there are questions, but apparently not yet. So maybe we can continue then, and not really getting away from this topic, but thinking of it in a different prospect. So we are now living this very challenging area, these urgent challenges that we have to face, but we should perhaps start thinking long term. And this means that there might be challenges, but also opportunities for this geopolitical climate that is starting now, for initiatives like this European Alliances initiatives, for Arqus. So Eva and Hans, do you envision any opportunities in this new geopolitical world that's happening now for initiatives like the European Alliances?
I'm going to let Hans begin this one.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think every alliance, every type of networking collaboration in this time, as I said before, is so important. So it is clear, even before we had the pandemic and before we had this radical genocide happening in Ukraine, it was clear that we can only, by working together, really make a difference for the future of our planet. So it is important to collaborate, and the European University Alliances are very important as a networking of an intensive way, where there is intention to really be innovative and transformative and inclusive. So there is an opportunity, but we have to take that opportunity as alliances and not let ourselves completely driven by the bureaucracy in Brussels. I mean, very positive that they do all kinds of things to support the alliances, but they should give the alliances a chance to discover themselves how they can make that transformation, how they can be inclusive and innovative, and take time to do that. We have seen in the past also efforts to try to make something happening, and they failed because there was too little support, too much bureaucracy, and too much an attention of making political use of those alliances. We should not do that. You as alliances need time to develop each other and to work together and include all your stakeholders. Then I see big opportunities for both the quality of teaching, the quality of your research, but in particular also the quality of your service to society. So there are opportunities, but it has to be intentional of the alliances and its members to really make a difference, and only see the support from Brussels as the kind of way to help them, but not let them direct what you are going to do.
Well, I actually think there are challenges that don't bring opportunities. They're just horrible. And I think this war is one of those. I don't like the expression, every challenge brings an opportunity. I don't think it's true. It is, at some point, we have to recognize that there's nothing but negative impact, and that's, I think, the result of this war. If I had to look at what we can learn from this, I would say a couple of things. I think that one is to recognize that Europe as a region came together, as an organization, institution, came together as rarely before that in response to the war. And I think that is a positive development. But I also think that we need to recognize that we reacted to this war and to the outpouring of refugees very differently to the way we react to other refugees as a continent. And I think that that is something we need to not forget as time goes on. I think that that is something that challenges us to really reflect on why did we react this way, and we can rationalize, well, it's Europe, it's close to us, etc. But I think it's more than that, and I think that Europe as a region needs, and all of us as institutions and as individuals need to really question how migrations and how the refugee mobility, which I think is going to stay with us for the near and middle future, how we're going to deal with that. And so I think that the way we've reacted to the Ukrainian refugees has been fantastic, but we cannot forget that this is the latest wave of many refugees escaping horrible situations to which we did not react in the same way. So to me, the opportunity here is to really reflect on how we face migration and how we face immigrants and refugees coming to our doorsteps.
Thank you both. So getting a better perspective of what it is to be a migrant, because we're closer to the problem in a way. Thank you. I think we have a question. Is that the case?
I have a question for Eva Egron-Polak. What do you think are the basic ingredients to feed, to nourish the soul of a university so that it becomes really good for promoting and realizing inclusion, diversity, and social justice? I don't know if I got the first point. What do you think, sorry for not taking my mask off, what do you think can be the basic ingredients, in a metaphor way, to nourish, to feed the soul of a university, so that universities and alliances can become really good for promoting, but also realizing in a practical way, inclusion, diversity, and social justice?
It's not an easy question. I think it is the recognition that universities and even the pursuit of truth or knowledge, which is their mission, is not an end in itself. Even though we say we will pursue truth wherever it takes us, no, I don't think that's, I think that pursuing truth and creating knowledge has to have, even the most distant, but has to have a purpose. We need to think of what will be the impact of that truth. I'm trying to think whether Galileo thought that, whether he, when he was doing his research and scientific testing, did he just do it because he was curious, or did he think it would take him somewhere and be useful? I don't know. But I believe that for universities to play their full role in society, they do need to see where their pursuit of truth is leading. To me, that is the soul of the university.
Hans, would you like to comment?
Well, first of all, I absolutely agree with Eva, but I also think that in that we have to rethink and re-emphasize the third mission of the university. So that third mission has, particularly in Europe and North America, become much more service to the private sector, service to industry, or service to own interest. And we have to go back to the original idea of the third mission of university is service to society. And we'll relate that to what we do in education and research, but also in how we bring the values of truth to society and help by that to really make a difference for society, and not only for the personal interest of academics, but also of the interest of industry, without taking into account that the consequences, what are these for society.
Thank you. Time for your second question from the audience.
Yes, so hello. I'm really glad for all the presentation which you did, and the special ideas which you expressed about Ukraine and the war which we have now. But I would like to come back to the name of this conference, Free to Choose, and the fostering the access. So nowadays world, and just watching from the perspective of students here in the northern world, like in the northern part of the world, we're facing issues with the high prices, accommodations, not enough places to live in, like for example in Amsterdam or Netherlands. Also facing issues, financial issues, which are stated, and I think every student had already before these times. But these are like the parts which we have now. Also watching to the southern part, there are a lot of issues with access in Latin Africa, with the indigenous groups, with all our different parts. So what would be your perspectives, and you know what kind of your experience which you have, what would be, the things which we could take on, what kind of actions as Arqus, as Alliance, we could take for this, especially for, the students who are in the southern part of the world, who are indigenous groups who hadn't had an access at all. Their families even don't understand what higher education is. So what we as an alliance could make for these kind of groups. I would be really thankful for your ideas and for this question. Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
I'm not sure whether I understood that you were asking what Arqus as an alliance could do for non-European.
Yes, of course.
You were? Well, first of all, I think that there is a part of Arqus that is globally engaged. There is a global engagement aspect of Arqus. But I think you're absolutely right in saying that, at least I think you were saying that, access has different connotations and meanings depending on where you're sitting. And perhaps in some parts of the Arqus Alliance, it's a matter of funding. In others, it's a matter of space. So I think, in my view, that first of all, the context in which that access is being sought is really very important. And in some cases, it is simply increasing space, increasing the capacity of the institution to admit more students. And that is still the case in many of the global south countries that Hans was talking about and that your Arqus Alliance is working with. But in places where it's not only a matter of space, but it is a matter of who gets in, I think, again, I talked about the fact that it is also about outreach, getting to the groups who may never think about a university because their parents didn't think about it, because their whole community has not really been engaged in university. So going to high schools or schools, which you, I think, are doing as outreach to instill the desire and the hope and the expectation that that's part of someone's future is very, very important. I think that we need to really think about, and I'm pretty sure the Action Line 2 group is doing that, think about how admission processes and standards, because I think there is a notion that access should be based on merit, and merit is defined by success in high school or secondary school, but we all know that that is not necessarily a way to judge the student's potential, and so we need to look at admission processes. We need to accompany students, learners who may not have all the prerequisites and all the tools they need to succeed in universities. And that's why I said just getting them in the door is not enough. I think there is a role for universities to really accompany those students and to ensure that the services and the counseling are geared to their needs. I was struck by Arqus because I've worked on underrepresented groups, but I think Arqus is the only alliance, or at least the alliance that I know, that looks at gifted students. It's true. It is a special group of students that need special care to be nurtured and to fit and to be able to successfully fit into the university. I also think that our faculty members need to understand the different and specific needs that are required when your classroom is very diverse, and diverse not just ethnically or racially, but also diverse in the sense of being prepared for higher education, being able to spend time devoted to higher education, not having to take care of your children or not having to work. Those realities of a diverse population of students need to be, I think, taken into account by faculty members and by the university services. So it's, I think, a whole university approach that needs to be taken to make access and accessibility more than just an empty promise, but really a successful integration into higher education. And my impression is that Arqus is really doing the best it can to address all of those different aspects. So I hope that answers partly. Okay.
Hans?
Yes, thank you. It's a very important, but also indeed very complex issue, the access to higher education, and what does that mean for the quality of education, and how can alliances like Arqus deal with that? If we look at Europe, we have been pretty successful in access to higher education. We are universal, over 70% of the age group is into higher education. At the same time, what we see still a serious problem with immigrants, refugees, and indigenous groups that have difficulty to access. So that's a very important point that also alliances and universities in Europe have to address. How can we do that? And they cannot do it alone. They have to have support of the government, but they also have to align much more with primary and secondary education, because most of the problems for access to higher education are coming from primary and secondary education quality, and also advices from those sectors to those communities. So there's a big challenge even in Europe to how that those groups can be accessing. In the global south, the problem is even more complex. We know that there's less than 50%, and in countries like in Africa, less than even 15% of the age group has access to higher education. And if they have access to higher education, they mostly have to go to private higher education, which is more costly and is in general of less quality than the public sector, because governments don't invest enough in public higher education. Even to the irony, if you, for instance, compare Argentina and Brazil, in the same continent, Argentina has less private higher education and more public higher education, but they don't invest enough in public higher education. So there's a massive inflow in public higher education, but the retention rate is extremely low. Where in Brazil, you have public higher education, which is difficult to access. And so only if you have families that are rich enough to invest in primary and secondary education, then you have access to public higher education. If you don't have that opportunity, you have to go to private higher education. So it is the low middle classes that have to pay for it, and even the rest of the population has no access. So you see, it is all very complicated issues, and it requires much investment from governments and to collaborate together to make this happen. What can alliances like Arqus do? They can at least be global in their perspective. They can also address, like the University of Padua does now with the Ukrainian students, refugees, the issues of refugees and immigrants, to make them much more accessible to the universities, and taking part in the exchange and cooperation between the members of the alliance to do that, and also being global in partnership with institutions in the global south to see how they can help with, in particular, also online facilities of teaching and learning and research to incorporate much more the accessibility. I have seen, for instance, in Brazil, at some universities, very good examples how they have brought higher education during the COVID time to the rural communities by providing students with laptops so that they could stay at home and work at home and learn. So although there is a resistance, correctly, too much of online teaching and learning for students, sometimes it can bring access to people who normally don't have access. So there are opportunities, and alliances like Arqus could be helping those universities to make that happen.
Just one comment. I agree with Hans, but this is an opportunity for the Alliance, because I think that the learning and the expertise and experience of different institutions within the alliance are quite different. And I think that, in a sense, there are two things that are really positive about this. First, by collaborating, they can learn from the best and adopt the best strategies in each individual institution. But more than that, I think that they can raise the issue as an important issue because it's an issue in the alliance. It can and has to become an issue at the institutional level. And I think that the power of that is really important, because sometimes, as I was saying yesterday to the group, inclusion and accessibility are put in contrast to quality, and saying, you know, if we do this, if we open our doors, we will lose quality. And I think that the important point is that first of all, it's not true, but also that by making this an alliance issue, you raise its visibility within each individual institution as a powerful tool. So,
thank you. So there's a question there. There. So, and here. Okay, let's start on the right-hand side.
Thank you. Actually, the conversation went into another direction now, but I want to come back. First of all, thank you for your inspiring speeches and thoughts, both of you. I want to just share a concern, maybe not so much a question, going back to also what you mentioned, Eva, also how Europe has been dealing refugees in very different ways. Thank you also for pointing out that. But my concern is we can see that the military budgets are going up now everywhere, not only in Europe, but in the world. So remilitarization is the action right now. So I'm very concerned that the budget of education and health will fall and be cut, because where do you get the money from if you put it in that direction? So how can the universities and the alliances react on that beyond just writing position papers and, you know, declarations, and investing in peace education, and also thinking of what we're now discussing on opening the doors, not only the higher education, but the education if there is not enough budget. It's just a big concern I'm seeing right now. Thank you.
I think it's a really, really critical point, and this shouldn't be a Q&A. This should be a debate and discussion. I don't have an answer to that, but I think you're absolutely right that there will be more demand on the public purse from this development. And yes, it's possible that education will suffer in terms of that. But I think the only lobbying effort that can be made is to quote UNESCO. The peace is in the minds of men. You build peace in the minds of men. And I think it's a really important motto, because it talks about education. You will never have a lasting peace unless you, at the same time, educate people for peace and prepare people for living together in the future. So I am of two minds about the military, in the sense that I can listen and hear the Ukrainian President Zelensky and his plea for help militarily, but at the same time, it's a very worrisome development in arming Europe to this extent. But I think the only way to make sure that education remains a priority in the public funding and public agenda is to insist on the fact that we are educating for peace and for the future, not and we cannot do that if we do not focus on the longer term. And not a very good answer, but it's the only one I have.
Hans.
I'm afraid it's indeed true that higher education will probably be suffering, like education in general, under the new circumstances with respect to funding. And that in a situation where already higher education in most countries is under enormous pressure. I mean, last week I think there was a report in the UK with saying that 50% of the academics in UK universities are thinking about leaving higher education because of the work pressure that they already face. We see similar trends in the United States. We see big concerns in countries like my own country, the Netherlands, about the work pressure that the faculty have. And so if there will be less investment in higher education, that will increase enormously more. And so we have to look into keeping the pressure over government of the importance of higher education for society, and also at the same time look at how can we lower that pressure by not getting into the rat race for grants, not getting into the rat race for publishing in top academic journals, focusing much more on open science initiatives, looking at ways of how we can recognize more the importance of teaching and learning and service to society instead of focusing only on research. That are also ways how we as institutions can make a difference to solve the problem. But that's all small steps, but I am afraid that indeed the challenge for the future will be much higher than it was ever before.
Thank you. So time is running, but we still have time for one more question. So please.
So my question would circle all the way back to the start when you were talking about different definitions of freedom, basically, right? And the different times we are. So on the one side of the border, we're talking about freedom as in leaving a country, and now we're talking about freedom in Canada as in like staying at a border with like loads of cars. Anyways, I was trying to figure out different definitions because we have loads today about accessibility, about freedom of speech, about lawful states. Even in Europe, we're not on the same page at most times. And I was wondering whether Arqus would be the right level of size, in a sense, to find suitable definitions for accessibility or for all the things Arqus is doing in the new mission statement, or whether we should go a level higher as in the EU, or whether Arqus is trying to do a thing which is really, really hard to achieve because there's such different circumstances in the different countries, right? Because although we're all in Europe, it's rather different in each country. So I was wondering whether that's the right size to start at, in your opinion.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, it's not either or. I think it's and. You have to address all those issues at all levels, at your individual level as a student, and your associations as faculty and their representative bodies as an institution, and also at the national and the European level. And alliances can play and should play a role, but are not the only ones that have to do that. So they have to do it in the contextual context of what we mean with Europe. As I said in my presentation, we really have to define what does Europe mean, also in an alliance like Arqus. What are your principles? And you have been thinking very carefully about that, with issues like freedom and inclusion as being very important parts of your alliances. And by doing that, you contribute, but you always will be a small contribution, but every small contribution is important to really address the issues that we have. And it's true that we see even in Europe, I mean, we have looked at the elections in Hungary and in Serbia this weekend, that we cannot really think that democracy is taken for granted there because of the way that the previous governments have controlled the media and the information and so on. So it is a challenge, but working with our academic community in those countries as well keeps us going. As I said, the same about Russia and Ukraine. We have to collaborate because that's the only way we can make a difference. But it all are small steps, but every small steps really makes a difference at the end.
I think I would start even smaller than Arqus. I would start at the institutional level, because I think that even at the institutional level, the word accessibility or inclusion or underrepresented groups resonate differently within the institution among the colleagues who populate that institution. So for me, I would start even at that, and I'm sure Arqus has done that. The discussion needs to be to get a shared sense of what these concepts mean and how we address them at the institutional level. Obviously, at Arqus level, you start all over again, but then you start from a reflection that has already taken place at home, if you will, and you bring that richness to the discussion at the Arqus level. I think that almost every change in a university, or every new, I won't say, well, new direction that we want to take needs that discussion so that we're more or less on the same page when we take it to the next level. So I think there is probably room for, as Hans said, working at all the levels. But I think contextually, the barriers to access, the opportunities to increasing it, the conditions of making it work are different. So to say we're all going to do the same thing doesn't make sense. But learning how to overcome these obstacles by learning from those who've overcome other obstacles can be extremely useful. So I think that it is a rich tapestry that you can sort of weave together as Arqus that is better than what you were able to do at the institutional level, better at the Arqus level, and then you can bring that to the other alliances and to Europe. But I think that we should not disregard that in a complicated and complex and multifaceted institution, as every university is, we say the word access and everybody knows what we mean. No. I talked yesterday with the group, and I had this long argument in France where the word inclusivité doesn't resonate at all. It's used, but it doesn't really work. They much prefer, and I think it's telling, they're fighting exclusion. Instead of fighting for inclusion, they fight all kinds of exclusion, because that means something different for them. So I think that the discussion about these concepts is really, really important. And I try to say some of them are very subjective, and we react physically or emotionally to these words because of your personal lives and trajectories. And I don't think we should forget those.
Thank you. So we're reaching the end of the session. I'm sorry, we don't have the time. I'm not allowed to. But before we end, we had as topic of the session how this European university initiative might contribute to this idea that we have, that we want a more freedom, that we want more inclusion, that we want more accessibility. So I will invite Hans perhaps first, and then Eva to give a short final remark and leave us a final message about that topic.
Yeah, I think we have addressed several of those elements already, but I think the most important is that this alliance should think how, based on its values, and I think you have defined those values very clearly, you can really make a substantial contribution to inclusiveness and freedom by being aware, what does it mean? Why are we doing this? And what is the impact of our alliance in making inclusion much more happening? being constantly having that on the agenda, your social responsibility, your civic engagement, your inclusiveness, that has to drive the agenda, and then you can make really substantive differences, Arqus, to really help the world. A small step again, but an important step, because you are covering institutions around Europe in different contexts, and doing it together, you really can make a difference in a positive way. Thank you.
Thank you. Eva?
My background is political economy. So I look at the alliances in that context. And I think it is a political construct. It was not launched just like that. It was launched because it is part of it's a building block towards building Europe. And I think when we see today what's happening, it is an important building block, and I think Europe still needs those building blocks. So from that perspective, I think it is a very, very important opportunity for universities to create binding and deep collaborations across the board in the institutions. I would underline the need that, in addition to a political agenda, I think there has to be an academic and scientific agenda in every alliance. One should not be subordinate to the other. And so I think it's important for the alliances to ensure that they're responding, sorry, I'm turning my back to all of you, that they're responding to and working on their academic and scientific agenda as much as they are on the political agenda of the European Commission or Union. That's really first. And second, I worked for many, many, many years for international cooperation globally. And so I would urge the alliances, all of them, not to turn their back in any shape or form on the wider world. They cannot stay just European. They need to remain as open and as connected to the wider world as each of the institutions has been before becoming part of the alliance. So I think that's something we need to be careful about because I know that the workload that comes with becoming and being a part of the alliance is incredibly heavy, and that everyone is very highly engaged in being and contributing to the alliance. But there is a bigger world out there, and I think that these relationships should be mutually reinforcing. What you're doing in the alliance will make you better partners to your external partners, and your external partners will enrich the alliance. So those would be my final words.
Thank you very much. It's time to close the session, unfortunately, so I want to thank the audience, and particularly the audience that raised some questions, so thank you very much. And I would ask everyone to join me in applauding our inspiring guests for this session. It was a wonderful session. I think it was a very interesting way to actually Arqus to reinforce the mission statement, and you have enlightened, in a way, some of the challenges that we have, so thank you for that, and thank you, everyone.
So thanks again to our guest of this first session, Professor Manuel João Costa, Eva Egron-Polak and Hans Witt, please. Thank you very much to all of you for the participation. Sorry for the limited time, but you know that's coming up the coffee break, so you maybe had the chance to continue speaking, and we invite you to join us in the conversation during the coffee break, but also during our next session that will be.
So coffee and hopefully some food will wait for us over there behind our shoulders. Please, we'll be back at 11:30. I know that we're going to be the bad guys asking for being punctual, but a lot is going on. Today, schedule is quite strict. We have a lot to discuss, so let's have a nice and deserved refreshment and see you in a while. Thank you.